All right, we are live. Thank you guys for tuning in for another video, another podcast. This is actually our first official podcast, and for those of you who didn't watch the intro video, we just want to invite and welcome you, and thank you for tuning in. We're going to dedicate this episode to talking about manhood and masculinity, especially as it pertains to men in the 21st century. We think that the current cultural climate and the fact that we are Generation Z, there's a particular unique perspective that we may have to offer on this. And we think that the discourse will be incredibly fruitful in terms of generating a well thought out overview and sensible presentation. So, yeah. Ash, I guess I can lead by asking you personally, what sort of prompted or motivated you to want to have this discussion?
Well, my initial involvement in the podcast came from you asking me about, wanting to do something in relation to masculinity and manhood. And I think for a while now I've seen that there is a lack of, for better or for worse, masculinity in our society, in American culture. I think it was once a long-held tradition that, there were certain roles that were to be played by the man, and I think we've more or less strayed away from that, and we are seeing the effects in all facets of life. You could see that in the workplace, in the home, in schools, in communities, in government, and so really what prompted my interest, or what sparked my interest, was just the friends that I have. The friends, and then even further than that, just other guys that I know. I think we oftentimes look for role models in our culture, in our communities, and we aren't necessarily met with the best versions of what a role model can be. 100%. And I think that's concerning. I think that's concerning for society, because oftentimes that leaves a gap for the fringe role models to come in and fill that role. And that's concerning, because then you see large groups of people that will tend towards a certain way of thinking that might just be sort of morally ambiguous or morally
misleading or misguiding.
Right.
And I think that's certainly the case with, I'll speak from my experience to hinge off of his point. One of my prompters or motivators for having this discussion was a few months ago, I initially noticed or was exposed to the ascension of Andrew Tate into stardom and fame. And of course, I think most people who know about him know that he's a very iconic, entertaining, charismatic figure. And that's great. But he's also, unfortunately, become a huge force in the name of manhood and masculinity, and being a sort of proponent for ideas that are not necessarily ideal or what we might consider ideal for manhood. And so a huge motivation for me is I want to be a voice of truth. I hopefully want to elaborate on my personal ideas and beliefs about what manhood is, what characteristics and qualities are essential to manhood, and hopefully give the impression that someone like Andrew Tate is not necessarily a man that young boys and young men should look up to and want to strive towards and emulate and be like. So, yeah.
From what I know about Andrew Tate is that I think a lot of people look at him as a misogynist, and I tend to take what the modern definition of misogyny is as like a grain of salt, because I know there are many proponents out there that there's a demonization, and there's almost an acceleration of what real misogyny is,
Hmm.
or maybe a deceleration, and it tends to bleed into just traditional masculinity instead of this domineering and diminutive role that you see some men play, and so. But having said that, I think Andrew Tate does, and people like him, they do portray qualities that aren't necessarily right,
Mm.
right, and
But certainly qualities that are desirable, right? Because at the end of the day, it seems like culturally, what, say, a lot of people value is a man who is macho, who has a nice physique, who has money and material things, or that's kind of how we value men, is like based on these kind of sometimes superficial or masculine traits. So, and I kind of like what you mentioned about the definition, like the modern definition or meaning of misogyny. It's kind of indicative to this entire discussion, which is most definitions of words that we use in everyday speech mean different things to different people, and so it's
Right.
highly subjective. Like what one person considers misogynistic or discriminatory, another person doesn't, and you could go all day arguing until you're both blue in the face about whether something is objectively offensive or not. I mean, the truth is that you'll always offend someone, right? I think there are definitely some things, just using Andrew Tate as an example, he says that have veracity and truth to them. But there are also many things that he says that, despite being veracious and true, are also very distasteful. And so I think that a part of being an ideal man, which I'll kind of elaborate on later, is you can speak the truth. You have the ability to speak the truth, but you know how to deliver it in a way that is palatable for many different people, right? So it doesn't mean that you have to modify the content of your message or your ideas. It simply means that you acknowledge how you say something or how you do something matters sometimes equally as much, if not more, than what you actually do. So that being said, I'm kind of curious to know, in your opinion, Ash, what do you think is the link between masculinity and manhood? Because obviously, and we talked about this off camera as well, these two things, they're inextricably linked, right? Like masculinity is to manhood what femininity is to womanhood. But I'm curious to know, like, to what extent does masculinity or being masculine make a man a man?
right. Well, so I think that masculine traits don't necessarily follow the male gender, right? There are females out there with masculine traits.
Right.
And I brought this, I posed this to you last night, that I think, we think of masculinity in two ways. It's actions and then it's appearance. So I think one of the most prominent things that comes to people's minds whenever we talk about masculinity is, masculine features, right? Big biceps, maybe a strong jawline, maybe a lot of facial hair, and
Right.
that's definitely a part of it. But I don't think that is that's in relation to like what men are, right?
Yeah.
Like generally, once we get past a certain age, we begin to mature into,
Appear a certain way.
yeah, exactly. We
And
just
also behave a certain way.
develop a certain appearance,
Right.
and that's biological. That's just what happens. But what doesn't necessarily happen, and this is one of the things that is concerning for society, is as boys grow into men, we don't necessarily take on masculine traits as much as we once might have. And so that's actions. That's number two. So there's appearance then actions, and I think masculine actions. When you think of masculinity in sort of like what I was mentioning earlier, any of these social avenues, so like communities, schools, the workplace, the family, you could say that you could continue that list. I think there are certain masculine roles that men are expected to play in those places. And in terms of the relationship to manhood, I think those masculine roles are necessary for boys to achieve manhood. Like the assumption of those roles. And again, the part that I think is demonized is that the assumption of those roles and the fact that in the past, people they took those roles probably too far in a domineering and diminutive way towards women,
Right.
And that sort of brought the opposition up and in sort of a combative way.
Yeah.
And now we're at a point where we throw around terms like toxic masculinity.
Right.
And, I think 90% of the time that's used in a way that is just, it doesn't fit what the actual crux of the situation is.
Well, yeah, and that kind of goes back to that point earlier, right, when we were talking about definitions and terms in themselves, like they're highly subjective. And so I want to know, in your opinion, precisely what would be considered toxic masculinity as opposed to masculinity in general. Like what masculine behavior would be considered toxic, or what do other people say is toxic of masculinity?
Right. Well, I think one of the biggest examples I consistently see is the fact that a man can be overbearing whenever whenever there is an opportunity for learning or teaching.
Yes.
The males, and this seems to always be the case, the male is overbearing towards the female.
Yeah. And I think that's where the term mansplain comes from.
Right, exactly. Mansplaining. And then to even further that point, you hear about just the simple physical act of man spreading. We are right.
Look at us right now. Like
exactly.
We're just all open.
We're giving ourselves space, and that, I think that idea, you can use it as a metaphor. It's sort of, it just enters space that otherwise shouldn't be taken up, except by the fact that you are a man and you're using your manhood or your masculinity to sort of just domineer
certain
everyone else's
dominance.
Space.
Yeah. And maybe not even intentionally, right? Like I'm doing this subconsciously, low key. Like it's just.
And that's where I think a lot of forgiveness and sort of just play has to be given, because where there are examples of people, being domineering and sort of just mansplaining, right?
Yeah.
We're giving our opinions in a way that is babying someone and really isn't productive, whereas we should, take a look at ourselves, be like, okay, they actually are intelligent, they can listen to instruction and follow instruction, and I should give them that, the benefit of the doubt and maybe back off, which that probably plays into just being a good teacher and being a good learner, which is easier said than done. And
it takes time and patience on the part of those who are receiving, right? Like we all have to be gracious and patient enough to realize that some people, well, let me back up. I think that a huge part of finding common ground is to realize that these masculine behaviors, or these supposedly toxic masculine behaviors, they come naturally to men. And so you gotta realize, like, is the person, this man who's hypothetically demonstrating this toxic masculine behavior, is he even aware that it's toxic, right? And I think that a lot of the narratives or dialogues that become mainstream is that all men intentionally do this stuff just to be jerks. Like they do it just to oppress people and domineer and dominate people, and it's not necessarily the case. I think that it's super important for men to raise their sons and mothers to raise their sons to grow up and know how to be respectful, know how to limit their self, and make sure that their masculinity or toxic masculine behavior does not infringe upon others or offend others. And to be clear, I mean, just to be fair, like, I think we could, if we took that to the extreme, like we would have a bunch of people who are afraid to be themselves, and we don't need to take it, we don't need to go that way either. But the point is there needs to be grace and patience on both ends of the spectrum. Like, people who have a negative view and attitude towards this topic, masculinity, and people who have a positive view towards it. Like, we just all need to acknowledge and realize this for what it is. And I think we've made some really good points on masculinity thus far. So
yeah, and I'm gonna loop us back to Andrew Tate and continue to talk about that side of just influence over young men. So one of the biggest issues I have with Andrew Tate is that the respect for women and the respect for the woman's role is, in my eyes, and he's probably refuted this. I know he's always coming out with stuff that is in refute of
his own controversy.
Right,
yeah,
exactly what he said about various things. And so, but what I've seen is that he is a womanizer. I think that's pretty
100%.
He's a womanizer, and that's plain to see. And the respect for a woman in an actual union, in an actual relationship where the man and the woman come together as one is not there. And that's really unfortunate, because I think that solidifies the fact that men, and this is a very feminist ideal or idea, is that men tend to objectify women. And I do not think, and let me retract my statement and say that boys objectify women.
Right.
And real men don't objectify women.
Right.
We actually we don't put them on a pedestal either. We make it an even playing field.
Right. Like, at the end of the day, we're equals. Like, it's not like it's not like you're my superior, but you're also not my inferior. Like, we're both human beings, and we're different. We're uniquely different. We may even have different roles, but that doesn't mean either of us are less valuable or less important, or so.
And the important thing there is, there's no value taken from the equation, because we both add value in places where the other is not able to add value.
Right.
So
there should be ideally a balance, and that's why it's necessary that we have both in society, because men and women make up society. We are literally the fabric of society. So it's important that we value each other. On another front, I kind of want to hinge on to the topic of manhood itself. So you said something just a second ago that I found very intriguing. I know we've talked about this off camera. You said that boys objectify women, not men. And so, in sort of realizing or conceptualizing manhood, we have to ask the question, what is a man? Aside from being a fully grown adult male, what makes a man a man? So, I was telling Ash, I actually have like 4 qualities or characteristics that I go to, and you could probably add to this, but there are 4 that I think are especially essential to manhood. The first being maturity, the second being values and beliefs, the third being leadership, and the fourth being learnedness. So, to sort of elaborate on each one, maturity, it kind of implies age and experience, but at the same time, as has already been alluded to, we can acknowledge that there are several adult males who aren't quite men because they're still behaving as boys, like adolescents. And so one of the key characteristics of a man is that he knows how to ascend above his adolescence. He knows that there was a time and a place in his life in which he was a boy, and now it is time to be a man and to assume the responsibilities that come along with manhood. The second one, which is values and beliefs, and this one is kind of like super broad, but essentially, I think that any good man worth his salt believes in something. And I don't mean that in a very cliche or abstract sense. I mean, he believes in something that is true and that has veracity to it, something that he can stand on and stand up for, something that he not only speaks on and speaks up for, but also defends and is willing to protect. And so this can come in the form of faith and religion. It can come in the form of, say, philosophical beliefs or science. It can come in the form of political beliefs. It can come in many different forms, but what you value, and this extends to just people in general, like what you value as a person, but especially as a man, is going to reflect how you behave and how you treat others, how you treat yourself, how you treat the world. So there's that one. There's also leadership, which when a lot of people think of leadership, they think of someone who's sitting up on a pedestal, giving orders and barking at people and sort of dominating and subjugating others. That is not leadership. I like to think that this third quality, leadership, is synonymous with humility, because in order to be a leader, you must be humble. Like, you must know how to serve others. And so good men, great, wonderful, strong men, they make those who are low to be high. They make the little people seem big. They lift others up and they support others. And an analogy that I shared with Asher last night, and we were talking about this off camera, was I like to think of a good man like a tree. So, you know, a tree, once it has fully grown and matured, I like to think of an oak tree when I visualize this. It branches out and it's very large, right? And it has taken a lot of nutrients and it has occupied some space in the course of its life. But another thing that it does is it provides shelter for so many other creatures, right? And so even when it dies, it deposits nutrients into the soil so that anything that comes after it may be able to grow up and be enriched. And so I say that to say that's the same way that we as men should be. Like, our lives, our very existence should enrich the existence of others. Even after we perish, even once we die, we should leave behind a legacy that others can look to and aspire towards, not to worship or idolize us, but just to know and be aware of, this is an ideal man. This is a solid role model and an example, someone who can lead me or help me live according to good ideas, good ideals, good values, etc. Then the last one, which is learnedness. This one's pretty self-explanatory in my opinion. I think that a good man, an ideal man, is wise, he is knowledgeable, he is open-minded, he cares about understanding things, not just things that he already knows or is aware of, but new things. He is not intentionally foolish or ignorant. He seeks to gain the perspectives of other people, if for no other reason than to understand them and try to ensure harmony and balance in the way that he treats them. So, aside from those things I said, like, you could probably add a heck of a lot more to that. And I think that, Asher, even you said that you found some of those like interchangeable with some other terms or definitions. Like,
yeah, the one thing I added to your list was through maturity, I often think we gain a sense of discipline.
Yeah.
About the way we interact with the world. That was the one trait that I was going to add, was that men are disciplined, and they just bring this perspective of, but
they bring a perspective of knowing how to go against what is convenient and comfortable. Right. So that's a part of being mature, is being disciplined. Like, someone who is disciplined, a man who is disciplined, will look at an uncomfortable situation or circumstance and not say, I'm going to fold just because it's easy, or not say, I'm going to remain seated just because it's convenient. He will have the discipline and the maturity to actually take action and do something. So
Yeah, and I guess I want to touch on maturity
Mm.
as those core tenets that you brought up in regards to manhood.
Yeah.
So if you would give me just like what's your view on where we start out as boys, and then what sort of maturity does it take for a man to go from I'm sort of or a boy to sort of go from I'm living how I want, how I see fit, and I don't really care about the effect of my actions, to what do you see as a man and how he differs in that way?
That's a really good question. So, like, short answer, I think that it's a lifelong process. So, I don't think that any man ever ascends into a level of maturity in which he stops maturing. Like, I think we always kind of mature in a sense. But as far as like, if we could use an illustration or analogy, like that light switching, like from boyhood to, oh, I'm a man now. Like, I think that the critical factor to consider here is experience, like experiences, because it's kind of like relates to something we were talking about the other day, which is somewhat unrelated to this, which you said you can know about things all day, but until you experience them, you have not yet learned them. And so the way we live life and the way that we learn through life is not merely by having people instructing us and telling us what to do and how to live our lives. No, we actually have to live and put into practice those things which we've been taught. And so I think once a boy begins doing that, which I think ideally should begin like in his teenage years, if he's had a good raising and, just a good upbringing, good raising, he should actually start to assume that role of, okay, I'm not a boy, I am now a man. I need to put into practice and actually live according to those things, like what I believe in, like what I want to stand for, what I want my life to be about. And I will also acknowledge that it's pretty obvious that a lot of people, a lot of men or adult males, they don't get to accomplish that in their teenage years or in their adolescence. Like they literally grow up and they're like 30 some odd years old and they're still not behaving in a mature way.
Right.
So,
yeah. And I think part of that is because you and I have a basis for morality. And more often than any time in the past, I would say, but I don't really, know this for a fact, but it seems this way, is that there is not as strong of a reason or a conversation in the household about what is good and what is bad and why you should be good versus why you should not.
Right.
Or you should abstain from being a bad person.
Right.
And I think, that the fact that morality in that sense just becomes a little ambiguous. There's more of, young men and children will turn to the world for an understanding as to, okay, I sort of see that I'm going to have to function within these parameters, and then what actions should I tend towards? Should I tend towards, self-fulfilling actions? Well, say, stealing. That's a self-fulfilling action. If I just don't have the money to pay for whatever thing I think that I need in my life, and so maybe I should take that route. Well, we live in a society where theft is, it's a crime. So, what are your thoughts on?
So when you, I'm really glad you mentioned morality, because morality is a part of values, right? Like what a person values is what they think is good, what they think is right, what they think is just, what they think is proper, correct, etc., etc. I think that our society has devolved into such a state that we simply value the wrong things. Like, for example, our society is very materialistic and based on consumerism. And so not only men, but people in general, they believe more in pursuing life and living life for the sake of acquiring things. And they think that their life purpose or meaning in life will be derived from those things that they possess. And don't get me wrong, while material things can make you happy, money can make you happy, money can certainly buy you happiness. You cannot buy the things that matter most in life. You can't buy friendships. You can't buy relationships. You can't buy peace of mind. You can't buy a sense of meaning and purpose that is internal to yourself. So, I don't think. Now, I hate to point out. I feel like we pointed out so many issues and problems about society, and I hate to always like point out problems without being prepared to suggest a solution. But honestly, I don't know any other solution than to redefine or recreate the way that we collectively see morality and value and values. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? I know you kind of like.
Well, I know that man will always be fallible and will always fall short.
Right, of course.
What is just, what is good. So I don't really think there is any other answer, except redefining where we get our answers from.
Right.
Which we're on the same page about that, I'm pretty sure.
Yes.
But I do want to loop back to sort of role models one more time. And I want to look at sort of what our role models growing up looked like, and then the values, because, I mean, just from personal experience, I think that we should be able to call ourselves men. We have assumed certain roles in our lives and sort of taken charge. I think that's a big part of where manhood comes from, is just being able to take charge of what's going on in your life. And I am definitely not perfect.
No one is.
Right.
No one is.
I still think that I have a little further to go to completely assume the role of a man.
And that kind of goes back to like what I was mentioning earlier. Like there definitely is a light switch, but it's not like once you turn on that light, it just kind of stays at the same brightness. It kind of just brightens a little more and more as you go.
Right.
You know, so like you continue to mature, even if you are a man. Like that's kind of a dignity thing. Like you have the dignity of a man because you have ascended into manhood. You've assumed your responsibility and just, different things. And, regardless of what you may gain or lose, you're still a man. Like if you have nothing else, you have your manhood. Like you have that dignity of, you know what? I'm responsible for my life. I'm responsible for the people who depend on me. And therefore I am a man. Now you mentioned talking about role models. I don't know if you want to like talk like personally about our role models. So I guess I'll mention. I was very fortunate to have an amazing father growing up. He is the hardest working person I know. He is one of the kindest people I know, and I've always told myself that if I could be just half the man he is, then I will have done something in my life. So he's not perfect. Right, I've seen him fall short, and I've seen him make mistakes, and just be a man. And I think that's really key. That's really key here to remember. Is like at the end of the day, we're men. We're not gods. Like we're not idols. Like as much as I love my father and I adore him and I honor him, and I want to be like him, at the end of the day, I acknowledge that he's just a man. But he certainly did play a huge role in showing me how to treat family, should I ever have a family someday. Like he showed me that no matter what, you always make sure that your family's fed, that they're cared for. You make sure that they are content. If they need counsel, you counsel them. If they're in need of anything, you provide. That, I mean, that's kind of one of the. It's almost like a primitive instinct, right? Like men naturally want to provide, and so I think that's probably the greatest value or behavior that my father has demonstrated is he's a provider. He makes sure that we have, that we're taken care of, that his family is taken care of. And I appreciate that so much. And I hurt and I ache because I know that many young men, many boys, even that I grew up alongside, they didn't have that. And I see the effect that it's had on their life. And it's honestly tragic because it represents an epidemic in this country that men do not assume the role that they should. But when they do, they have the potential to produce not only literal offspring, but also offspring in the sense of those whom they influence that can more resemble things that are true and right. So
yeah, and so the two things I really liked that you touched on was first responsibility. Men take on a certain level of responsibility in the household, and like you said, that is providence, correction, leadership, and then just those basic roles like I'm going to provide food and shelter and care, and if anything is wrong, I'm going to be the first to respond in like a protective way. And so that's one of the things I really liked about what you said. And then the second is you didn't say this out loud, but I thought of it, is just the willingness to admit mistakes.
Right.
Is essential.
Yes.
And I think a lot of men miss that mark. And I think you might agree, is that and it's just it's something that will continually affect mankind, is that pride gets in the way.
Yes.
Of admitting a fault, admitting a wrong, and that carries out into people's lives. Like if you do something wrong, you wrong a person, and I don't have any children, so I wouldn't necessarily know this, but if I were done wrong by my father or by any person in my life, I would want them to admit their fault so that I had the comfort of knowing that this person, they love me enough that they would admit their mistake to me.
Right.
But also, and more importantly, and then I think this gets into the absence of men in many households, is that I had an example of a man admitting his fault. And that is something that we don't see in society.
And it's super underrated.
Yep.
It's super underrated. Like, especially, and I know this is not directly tied to what we're talking about, but like in politics, for example, like, and I don't want to have a discussion about politics, but you just see so many instances of political figures who, once something comes out about what they've done that was scandalous or wrong, they never apologize and admit fault. Like, and these are people that are widely idolized and worshipped and adored. And it's like, we don't need examples like that. We need examples of people who are humble, people who are not afraid to admit fault. Because at the end of the day, in addition to demonstrating love towards those who you wronged, which is super important, it's also important to yourself. Like, if you've done something wrong, you acknowledge that you've done something wrong so that you can improve yourself. It's like you don't do the wrong thing, acknowledge that you've done the wrong thing, fail to admit it, and then just continue in your ways. You want to, at some point, be like, you know what I did was so wrong, and I don't want to do it again, and therefore I need to change how I'm doing stuff. Like I need to change how I'm acting. So
right. And that brings me to a point about back to sort of the domineering role of man and why that is looked at as toxic. But there's also the other side. So we sort of talked about submission there, right? Sometimes men need to be submissive in that, okay, I messed up, I'm wrong, I did the wrong thing, here's my humility, and I'm showing you that as an example so that, you'll be able to admit your faults, when the time comes, because everyone clearly messes up and
100%
is going to be in the wrong at some point in their life. And then I guess the flip side of that, which we touched on at the beginning, was just the domineering role, or I don't want to call it. I no longer want to call it domineering. I want to call it pronounced, the pronounced role of man. So, one thing we were going to talk about is, and you quoted this yesterday, off camera, like you keep saying, whenever good men stand by and do nothing, evil prevails.
Right.
So,
And that was another huge prompter for this video, because, like, not to imply that we ourselves are good men, but we're trying, we're young men. We're trying to assume the role of adulthood and manhood. And so we, as has already kind of been elaborated on, we made some observations, not only of our peers, but of society in general. And we think that if we're aware of the things that are going on and that they're wrong and that they're not good, then we need to speak up about it. Like, we need to take deliberate action to speak the truth, to be a voice for truth. So,
and I think that goes back to one of the reasons behind this podcast.
Yeah, of course.
We saw
100%.
a lacking in friends and in people, in role models. That is, there aren't enough good men out there willing to assume the role of leadership and modeling themselves for this generation. And I think it's leading to, everything in regards to young men is, every bad statistic is up, if you want to look at it that way.
Yeah.
So, like, suicide among young men is, way up more than it's been in the past. Addictions, whether it's drug addiction or pornography or, what have you, that's way up as compared to the past. I don't know about, like, crime, but if I had to guess, the statistics surrounding crime among our age group is probably up.
Even if statistics are down, crime is still prevalent.
Right, yeah.
Like, that's the bottom line. It's like,
yeah. And I think, that is all because, so like I said, there's probably a lack of the basis for morality in the home, and then there are few decent and even fewer good role models for young men in our society.
and if I can modify that quote, I want to say, instead of using the word good, let's use courageous. Let's say courageous, because it's not so much that we're good, we're virtuous, we're righteous. I mean, we could debate about that in itself, but one thing we can't debate on is whether we have courage, whether we lack courage or whether we possess it. And courage is demonstrated through action, even in the face of opposition or scrutiny or just outright defamation. Like, we still speak the truth regardless of the consequence, because it is the right thing to do. So,
and we have no responsibility either to necessarily put stuff out there for people to see that is encouraging. So a good man, there are plenty of good men out there, and I believe that, but there aren't necessarily plenty of good men out in the world that are being courageous at this moment. But it's
right.
It's also not their responsibility to necessarily be courageous, in that they have to seek out people or seek out other young men,
right,
to have a positive effect on.
Yeah, to influence and to mentor. Though I think it is certainly something that we should all desire as men.
Yeah.
But that's the thing, is that if there's nothing obliging us to do that, then we just have any and everybody who can run rampant and influence young, impressionable people, and hence steer the course of human history.
And I don't think it's an easy thing to put things out like this.
Certainly not.
in the influence of young guys. So it's no wonder that, the things that are being propped up on platforms like YouTube or TikTok or Instagram or whatever are, like I said at the beginning, just the fringe of masculine beliefs and masculine characteristics. So
right.
I guess to touch on just a few things that the male role models in my life sort of taught me, and these are fairly basic, but hard work is definitely one, and that just correlates with providence and being prepared to provide for your family and for yourself. And so my dad actually puts it a way that um, puts providence and the building up of our family in a funny way. He calls it the so my last name is Hamlin. He calls it we're building up the Hamlin Empire,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I think that is another responsibility that a lot of people miss is that every action, whether it be something that will build your wealth or just something that will build familial character or
Mm-hmm.
um, family culture,
Yes.
all of those things, all of your actions have some sort of effect. So
100%.
he that idea carries out not only to like the job that I currently have, and I'm building the Hamlin Empire through I'm making money for myself and sort of building my own my own repertoire or
Your own kingdom.
my, my own kingdom, but just building myself up and becoming a pronounced figure,
Yeah.
becoming a pronounced man. Um,
Your own man.
right, but also in that is that just like my basis for morality, I am trying to be a good man, trying to do right by my neighbor, do right by my friend, do right by a future spouse, do right by family, and those little social contracts that we have with people often go overlooked,
Mm.
in my opinion. So yeah, that was one of the valuable things he taught me is that work hard, but do it for the future, do it for the now, but do it for the future and what you might eventually have, I guess.
Yes.
Not in terms of material, but in terms of
Those
influence.
things. Those things that can't be bought.
Exactly.
Right. Those things that must be earned through good action, good thoughts, good beliefs, those things.
Right. Yeah. And that's been incredibly valuable. And then another thing that is pretty obvious is, which I spoke to as to one of the things that I didn't like about Andrew Tate was just respect for women.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my family, we're a God-fearing family, and so we believe that man and the woman, they have a role in the marriage uh, as God ordained it, and that, like I was talking about earlier, the man has specific roles and the woman has specific roles, but they should never clash. And of course they're going to clash because we're fallible, we are.
But that clash should not be on the basis of, oh, you're more important or oh, you're less important.
Exactly.
It's like, oh, your role is superior, or oh, your role is inferior. It's like, no, we're both valuable. Like, we are both valuable.
We both have something to add. And that's, something that I've been extremely blessed with to grow up with in my household. And Geo, I think, sees it the same way.
Yeah,
it's
100%.
Something that is immeasurably invaluable.
Right.
But yeah, I think so. These roles, and then the respect aspect of a relationship is often overlooked. And I think it truly does take a man to be able to say, all right, I'm no longer going to look at a woman as a means to get something.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one of the most obvious things is whenever I was a younger man, and we're all going to struggle with this, but we think of women as a means to get sex.
Yes,
right?
100%.
Like
objectifying women.
Exactly. I think that is the baseline idea.
Right.
That,
But that is not a woman's value, is how she can satisfy or pleasure me through sexual intercourse. Like, that is not a woman's value. And mature, real men, they understand that. Like, I know some guys personally who all they obsess about, all they think about is who they're going to hook up with this weekend. Like, who are they going to hook up with? Where are they going to get drunk? Like, these very immature, superficial things. And seemingly they have no understanding of a woman is a human being. She's a person with a mind, with a heart, with intentions, with a will, with beliefs in herself. And that's something that, like, just sort of scratching the surface on this video, we didn't talk about womanhood because obviously we're not women. but womanhood is important to contrast with manhood. And I think maybe in the future we could do like a video where we invite some women onto the podcast and see what their perspective is on both of those topics. But yeah, it's important that men know themselves and know about themselves in relation to women. So I'm glad you brought that up. It's very important.
Yep. And I've said this I was really on this binge or this stint where a couple years ago where I just
Hypersexualization.
saw the sexualization of our culture in every facet.
Hypersexualization.
And I think we were going to touch on this a little later in the podcast, but I figured I would just bring it up now.
Yeah.
The modern feminist movement and the supposed equalization of, the male and the female in society. I think that has produced good, but I also think it's produced a lot of negative things for not only men, and that's, what probably is expected to be talked about is, the hyperfeminization has just degraded the man. I think it has actually, it's paradoxical because you think that it's, the role of the woman has been upgraded and she has been liberated, but I would argue that it has actually degraded women even further to the point where, once you could have seen the very traditional role of the woman in the household as, oh, she's just there to cook, clean, and have children. Whereas now it's, she's expected to do the things that men traditionally have done in society. So work and produce and do the hard things. And then on top of that, we have hypersexualized women.
Right.
And I don't know if you struggle with this, but for me, the liberation of women, it seems that it's just, you see it everywhere. I mean, on TV, on social medias, it's just, here is my body and here's what I have to offer.
And my question is that really liberalizing women? In my opinion, that's further objectifying women.
Exactly.
Or encouraging behavior and ideas that seek to objectify women. And certainly not helpful to the movement of ensuring equality.
Yeah, and in terms of who is to blame, I don't think that either gender is specifically to be blamed, and I don't think either gender is blameless in this matter either. I think we are both at fault of, men have encouraged this hypersexualization, and I think women have encouraged it and probably are proponents of it in some ways. And then obviously there are women that are not, and obviously there are men that are not and are on the opposite side of that.
Right. The bottom line, or the common ground we can all arrive at, is that there's no one way to view this issue, and there's no one perspective that is indicative of just exclusively men or women. Like, the bottom line is that you could take either, on the spectrum of masculinity versus femininity, you could take either to its extreme, right? And so I think either extreme is very bad, distasteful, and undesirable. We need to understand there's a balance, right? There is definitely a necessity on both ends for men and women, whether they be masculine or feminine, to understand like either behavior could be undesirable, intentionally or intentionally. What did I say? Intentionally or unintentionally? I meant to say intentionally or unintentionally. And like kind of like what I said at the beginning of this podcast, like it's just necessary for us to have grace and patience with each other and know how to correct each other in a way that is palatable, right?
Yep.
So
Yeah, and I actually mentioned this to you yesterday about how a lot of our social issues, there have been blanket solutions
yes,
to many of our social issues, and so I think this is one of the things that isn't isn't solvable or isn't genuinely solvable by we're going to blanket statement this issue with solutions, and that is not necessarily going to work for every individual.
the irony is that there really doesn't need to be a solution other than acknowledging that we're equals and that we're both important, and regardless of our characteristics or differences, we're still equal. Like that is the solution. And I mean, maybe it's not the solution that people want, but that's the truth. Is like, do you believe, yes or no, do you believe human beings, regardless of their characteristics, are equal? And I don't mean equal in a literal sense. I mean equal in terms of their rights, their natural rights, like that they should be ensured personal freedom and liberty and protection under the law, like all those good things. Like, do you believe that we are innately equal, fundamentally the same? We have the same desires, and well, maybe not the same desires, but the same basic needs and the same basic desires, like food, shelter, etc. That's where I think we find common ground. We just need to focus more on what makes us alike than different, and stop acting like these differences constitute a problem, because they really don't. They only constitute a problem insofar that we want to make them a problem. So
yeah, and I think a lot of those little differences, they can often, they become the focus of the marriage or the unity between man and woman.
mm-hmm.
And that's where the problems start to fester.
Yeah.
Within those differences. And
right.
Instead of focusing on the value in what either person has to bring into that unity, we choose to focus on the devaluation of what those characteristics detract from that unity.
Right.
And it's a real shame. And I guess my only answer is really that there just needs to be, like you were saying, more forgiveness and more, not necessarily, I don't like the word leeway, because that
kind of implies that somebody could run over without.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That implies.
But I mean, grace, like we need to have grace. Like, you need to understand that people are going to make mistakes, and we're going to have to at some point correct others, but that doesn't mean you have to like you have to like punish them. Like, it doesn't mean that you have to demonize them. It just means that, like, at some point we need to be both concerned to pursue this one common objective and goal, which is we need to live in harmony, we need to live in balance, we need to live in peace.
And then to go back to why evil prevails whenever, as you put it, courageous men aren't, they don't speak up about issues. It almost is because, we've detracted so far. So, I mean, I don't know if you have any examples, but one example I can think of is the way that we treated COVID. I don't know if this is a good example for you, but
I don't know. Let me hear it.
So the way that, in my opinion, the way that we treated COVID and went about COVID is people weren't as spoken up as they should have been about some of the injustices that occurred. And regardless as to where you sort of stand on that issue, I think that we can clearly see that some of the answers to the virus weren't functional, and they hurt more people than we let on. And I think the consistent factor there is that men weren't outspoken about the injustice,
Right.
and it sort of was just allowed to occur.
And also, men lack sense. There's a lot of things that occurred during that chapter of history that just that were contrary to common sense. Like, ultimately, here's my thing on the whole COVID issue, regardless of what practice or solution you thought should have been implemented or whatever. At the end of the day, we should have the compassion towards other people to realize that we have the potential to influence them and affect them. And so with regards to COVID being a highly contagious disease, the very least that we could do is simply make sure that we do everything. We could have done everything we could within reason to ensure that we did not put anybody else at harm, period. So that's kind of my take on that. I think that simple view was severely lacking. I think there's just so much agenda and politics mixed in with it that people forgot, like, at the end of the day, like, the reason that we ought to do anything is to realize our compassion and our care for our neighbors, like for those who we have the potential to harm. So,
yep. Harm or
benefit.
Benefit.
Right? Yeah.
That's what I was gonna say.
Yeah, left that open.
So we've already touched on role models, speaking truth.
Speaking truth.
So,
which is integral to this podcast in general.
Yeah.
Speaking truth.
And one of the ways that speaking truth comes about is through civil discourse.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And I think that's one of the things that the modern man and the modern woman we miss, is that we're unwilling to have a conversation and come to a truth about, any matter that is out there. And I guess sort of since this is our first podcast, to sort of wrap it back to the reasoning behind this podcast is that we just would both really like to, between the two of us, and then hopefully between people in the future, be able to come to conclusions surrounding truths,
right,
about whatever the topic is on the day of. So
right, 100%. Yeah, like, just to sort of tie it all together. Ultimately, we want to do what is true. Like, that's my personal mission in life. I want to embody truth. I want to do truth. I want to speak truth. I want to think truth. And so, if this platform lends itself towards doing that and sharing that pursuit with others, then I am exceedingly glad for anybody who may watch or listen to join. And not just join me, but join us. And again, I can't express again how thankful I am that there are people like Asher who seek to understand more and who seek to have conversation in a civil, level-headed, sensible way. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you too, Gio.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it going forward. I hope that today, and if you want to continue to discuss manhood and masculinity, I'm completely open to it.
Maybe we can continue this like on a part 2 or something.
Yeah,
I feel like we made a lot of progress today. Like, that was a very good discussion. Yeah. I feel like.
I guess in conclusion, I just want to really encourage, if you are a young guy out there, listening to our podcast, I want to just encourage you to, continue to be a better man, not only for yourself, because I think that's a mark that a lot of us miss, is that being a man is good for the self. Not only is it good for society when it's used, when manhood is used correctly, but it helps the mind, I would say. It helps give you drive and purpose. And it's like, I'm going to fit into the mold that I was given, right? So yeah, I want to encourage everybody that's out there that's listening. If you're, not 20 to 30 years old and, you're listening to us, I want to encourage you to. And maybe you're not a man, maybe you're a woman.
Yeah, everybody's welcome.
Everybody is welcome. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. We should probably do a part 2.
100%.
So yeah, keep getting after it. Any closing thoughts?
Yeah. Again, as always, if you have any thoughts, opinions, critiques, etc., please feel free to add that. We look forward to interacting with you and seeing you again soon. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.